This is the story of what actually happens before a chocolate bar reaches your hand. And once you understand how it's really made, who makes it, and what's hiding inside it, the wrapper starts to feel a lot heavier. Millions of people unwrap one every day without a second thought. But behind that wrapper sits a supply chain stretching across 3 continents, passing through at least 10 pairs of hands over 3 to 6 months, and touching nearly every dark issue you can name, from child labor and deforestation to heavy metal contamination and corporate secrecy. Let's walk through it, one step at a time. The journey begins in West Africa, where roughly 2/3 of the world's cocoa comes from just 2 countries, Ivory Coast and Ghana, with Ivory Coast alone producing around 40% of the global supply. That cocoa starts on small family farms worked by farmers in their late 40s or 50s. Their trees are aging, their yields have collapsed to about half of what they used to be, and most of them earn between $1 and $2 a day, which sits below the World Bank's extreme poverty line.
Here's the part that tends to stick with people. Those farmers receive only about 6 to 7% of the final retail price of a chocolate bar, a share that used to be around 16% back in the 1980s. And most of them have never actually tasted chocolate. In 2014, a Dutch film crew handed a bar to an Ivorian cocoa farmer named Inda Alphonse, and his reaction was, quote, "Ooh, it's nice and very sweet. This is why white people are so healthy." This from a man who had spent his entire life growing them. Now, about how those beans actually become chocolate, because this is where things get genuinely strange. Once the pods are cut down by hand with machetes, the beans get piled into heaps or wooden boxes and covered with banana leaves. And then they rot, which is not a metaphor. Over roughly a week, yeasts and bacteria ferment the pulp surrounding the beans. Temperatures inside the pile climb to nearly 50 degrees Celsius, and the combination of heat and acid kills the embryo inside each bean while triggering the chemical reactions that produce chocolate flavor. Without this controlled rotting, chocolate wouldn't taste like chocolate at all. The beans then dry in the sun for another week or so, often on mats placed beside the road. And this is where a big part of the contamination problem begins, because dust, dirt, and lead settle onto the beans during that exposure. From there, they get shipped overseas, roasted, ground, and finally conched, a process invented by Rodolphe Lindt in Bern in 1879 that stirs the chocolate for up to 72 hours to develop its flavor. 3 to 6 months, at least 10 pairs of hands, and the farmer who grew it earns roughly the price of a single Snickers bar for a day of labor. But that's only the process. The bigger question is who actually does the work? In October 2020, researchers at the University of Chicago published a report commissioned by the U.S. Department of Labor, and the findings were staggering. With 1.56 million children working in cocoa production across Ivory Coast and Ghana, 95% of those kids were performing hazardous labor involving machetes, agrochemicals, and forest clearing. Here's the part the industry would rather you not focus on. The rate of child labor actually climbed over the previous decade, rising from 31% to 45%. Back in 2001, the major chocolate companies, Hershey, Mars, Nestle, and others, signed something called the Harkin-Engel Protocol, which was originally drafted as a binding law requiring chocolate to carry a slave-free label. The industry brought in former Senators George Mitchell and Bob Dole as lobbyists, and the bill was watered down into a voluntary agreement. The deadline to eliminate the worst forms of child labor was 2005, which then slipped to 2008, then 2010, then 2020. And every single one of those deadlines has been missed. In 2019, the Washington Post asked Mars, Hershey, and Nestle a simple question. Could any of them guarantee their chocolate was free from child labor? None of them said yes. Mars could trace only about a quarter of its cocoa back to the farm. Hershey could trace less than half, and Nestle landed at 49%. 2 years later, 8 former Malian children who said they had been trafficked and enslaved on Ivorian cocoa farms took their case against Nestle and Cargill to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the ruling came down 8-1 against them, because the abuse itself happened in Ivory Coast,
rather than inside the United States. While all of this was unfolding, the forests of West Africa were quietly vanishing. Since gaining independence in 1960, Ivory Coast has lost 92% of its primary forest, and cocoa is the main engine behind that collapse. A 2017 investigation by the environmental group Mighty Earth revealed that 90% of Ivory Coast's protected national parks had been deforested for cocoa, and the country's elephant population collapsed from several 100,000 animals down to somewhere between 200 and 400. That same year, 35 of the world's largest chocolate companies signed the Cocoa and Forests Initiative and promised to end deforestation. In the 5 years that followed, Ivory Coast and Ghana together lost nearly 60,000 more hectares of forest, an area roughly the size of Chicago. Which brings us to what's actually inside the bar sitting on your counter. In December 2022, Consumer Reports tested 28 dark chocolate bars from major brands, and every single one contained lead and cadmium. 23 of those 28 exceeded California's safe daily limit for at least one of the two metals. 1 ounce of Hershey's Special Dark carried 265% of the daily lead limit, and 1 ounce of Perugina Premium Dark clocked in at 539%. Here's the counterintuitive part. Organic chocolate turned out to be no safer, and in many cases tested worse. Cadmium gets absorbed directly from the soil by the cacao tree itself, while lead settles onto the beans after harvest during that sun-drying phase. The Centers for Disease Control states there is no safe level of lead exposure for children, and cadmium is classified by the International Agency for Research on Cancer as a Group 1 human carcinogen. The chocolate itself raises its own questions. Under FDA rules, a Hershey's milk chocolate bar is only required to contain 10% actual chocolate, while the European minimum sits at 25%. In 2007, the chocolate industry actually petitioned the FDA to let them replace cocoa butter with vegetable oil and still legally call the result chocolate. And only a consumer revolt managed to shut the petition down. The FDA's own published standard, by the way, allows chocolate to contain up to 60 insect fragments and 1 rodent hair per 100 grams before it's considered legally adulterated. That distinctive tangy note in a Hershey bar comes from butyric acid, which is the same acid found in vomit. Now, who actually controls all of this? Most people picture the brand names: Hershey, Mars, Nestle, Mondelez, Ferrero, Lindt. But the companies that actually process and trade the cocoa behind those brands are names most people have never heard. Just 4 of them, Barry Callebaut, Cargill, Olam, and Ecom, handle roughly 75% of the world's cocoa. Barry Callebaut, based in Zurich, is the largest chocolate manufacturer on Earth, and it makes chocolate on contract for Hershey, Nestle, Mondelez, and Unilever. When you eat a Hershey's Kiss, there's a good chance the chocolate inside it was actually produced by Barry Callebaut. Then came 2024. For decades, cocoa prices hovered somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000 per ton, and the all-time record set in July of 1977 had stood unbroken for 47 years. In March of 2024, cocoa crossed $10,000 per ton, and by the end of the year, the market hit an intraday peak of over $12,600, nearly 3 times where it had started. The causes stacked up from every direction, from a virus that now infects 81% of Ghana's main cocoa-growing region, to black pod disease, aging trees, and illegal gold mining that has destroyed more than 100,000 acres of Ghanaian cocoa farms. By April of 2026, cocoa prices had crashed back down by roughly 74% from the peak. Chocolate prices, though, didn't come back down. In July of 2025, Hershey announced low double-digit % price increases, and CEO Michelle Buck confirmed on an earnings call that the company was using, quote, every tool in our toolbox, including pricing. That translated into shrinkflation, meaning smaller bars at the same price, and Mars quietly shaved 10 grams off its Galaxy bar without dropping the price tag. So let's pull all of this together. From pod to bar, chocolate is the product of a supply chain
built on farmers earning $1 or $2 a day, 1.56 million children working mostly in hazardous conditions, 90% of Ivory Coast's national parks deforested, heavy metals in nearly every bar tested, and 4 companies most people have never heard of controlling 3/4 of the global trade. The industry has been promising to fix all of this since 2001, and every deadline has slipped. In 1909, when the Cadbury family sued a newspaper that had exposed slavery in their supply chain, the court awarded them damages of exactly 1 farthing, 1/4 of a penny, as a deliberate signal that Cadbury had technically won but was morally in the wrong. More than a century later, the same industry is still fighting the same accusations. The next time you unwrap a bar, you'll know exactly what it took to get it into your hand. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe for more videos like this. See you in the next one.